Welcome to VSOW. Today we're doing a deep dive into, well, what has to be one of the most huge and important human stories of the last, 500 years? The complex tapestry of the African diaspora. And the sources we're drawing on today, they're really broad.
Everything from foundational academic work, cultural history.
Philosophy, right, but also current economic reports.
And even, those really personal, sometimes difficult debates happening online right now.
Exactly. So it's a wide net.
It is. And our mission today, really, is to explore this global phenomenon, but to go beyond maybe the simple stories. We have to anchor it, I think, in where it began, that profound historical trauma, the transatlantic slave trade, colonialism,
Right.
and then track how that trauma actually forged unique, resilient cultures across the globe.
Yeah.
And finally, look at its impact today, the real, tangible effects on global economics and, identity politics.
And the sheer scale, the numbers alone, they tell you immediately why this is such a critical global conversation, why we need this deep dive. We're talking about, over 170 million people of African descent living outside Africa itself?
Yeah, it's enormous.
I mean, that's like the population of a major world nation, but spread across every continent.
And that huge number, it needs context, doesn't it?
Yeah.
To really get the dispersal pattern. The sources show Latin America has the largest group, about 113 million people of African descent there.
Wow, 113 million.
Then North America, around 39 million. The Caribbean, about 14 million. And Europe, maybe 4 million. So it's not just a U.S. story or a Caribbean story. It's truly global, a pattern of forced movement and cultural mixing.
And what I found really fascinating in the material is how African institutions themselves formally recognize this identity. The African Union, for instance, their definition isn't just geographical.
No, it's intentional.
It focuses on agency, right?
Yeah.
People of African origin outside the continent, regardless of citizenship, who are willing to contribute to the continent's development.
Willing to contribute.
Yeah.
It links identity directly with purpose, with action.
Yeah, it's powerful.
And what's fascinating there is that definition inherently acknowledges why people were dispersed,
Yeah.
while also trying to turn that history into a potential asset for the future. So as we get into the analysis, we absolutely have to establish that historical trauma, the slave trade, colonialism as, well, the pivotal and profoundly destructive force that shaped this whole global identity.
Absolutely.
If we skip over the forced dispersal, the rest of it, the culture, the economics, the identity, it just hangs there without its crucial, painful context.
Okay, so let's unpack that. The destructive legacy, the foundational trauma, this is really where the diaspora identity begins, isn't it?
It is.
The sources are clear. The transatlantic slave trade is the historical epicenter. We hear the figures, but they're worth repeating, just to grasp the scale. An estimated 10 to 15 million Africans forcibly taken, transported to the Americas, the Caribbean, Latin America, between the 15th and 19th centuries. Just unimaginable numbers.
And that forced trafficking, it had two immediate devastating consequences, really intertwined.
Right.
First, obviously, the profound loss of cultural heritage, identity, connection to home. You can't quantify that.
No.
Slavery was designed to shatter communities, cultures, social systems.
Yeah.
Systematically. The whole point was forced labor, enforced by violence, and crucially, cultural suppression. It demanded erasing existing identities.
And the second consequence, maybe even more insidious in the long run,
Yes.
was the introduction of what the sources call the language of race.
Oh, yes.
Before European expansion and the trade really ramped up in the 15th century, people in Africa primarily identified by kinship, lineage, ethnicity, specific traditions, languages, political groups.
Right. The other was a foreigner, not defined by skin color.
Exactly. And the Europeans replaced that complex, self-defined system with this crude blanket concept, race.
A rigid category. And it became fundamentally linked to the mechanics of the slave trade itself. By labeling people based on this idea of race, rather than their specific ethnicity, it simplified and justified the mass dehumanization needed for chattel slavery.
Yeah.
And that laid the groundwork for the systemic racial discrimination that, frankly, still shapes societies today.
But that destructive wave, it didn't just hit those who were taken. For those who remained on the continent, colonialism then compounded the trauma, leading to what some sources call an equally severe identity crisis or even mental enslavement. How did colonialism manage to deepen that wound so effectively?
Well, it was a wholesale imposition, wasn't it?
Yeah.
European laws, customs, languages, economic systems, just layered over existing African structures, systematically done, and justified, infamously, under the banner of the civilizing mission,
Right, the civilizing mission.
which really meant systematically suppressing diverse African cultural practices. It created this deep cultural alienation. It was designed to make Africans feel their own traditions were inadequate, pushing them towards Western identities. And indigenous economies, political systems, forcibly replaced with systems built purely for extraction resources and wealth flowing out to the colonizer.
And this cultural displacement, it leads directly to what the sources call the colonial mentality. What does that look like in practice? What's the evidence?
You see it so clearly in things like aesthetics and education. This mentality pushed Africans to see Western identity, Western values, as inherently better. So foreign languages, English, French, Portuguese, they became the official languages, the languages of power, government, school,
While African languages.
were relegated to vernacular, implying they were secondary, less important, maybe even primitive.
That's incredibly damaging.
Hugely. And it affected beauty standards, too. A massive glamour for light skin emerged, seen as the standard for beauty, for social mobility, often denigrating traditional African features.
And layered on top of that were the relentless negative portrayals coming from the West.
Oh, absolutely.
Africa and its people labeled primitive, pagan, uncivilized. Even major Western thinkers, Hume, Hegel, pushed ideas of Africans being naturally inferior, lacking history, lacking reason.
And these negative stereotypes, they weren't just external insults. They became deeply ingrained, influencing how generations of Africans in the diaspora saw themselves as lesser, maybe not worthy of world history.
It's a denial of self-identity, creating this huge internal void, a psychological break.
Exactly, which then becomes a major driver for the liberation movements that followed. And this problem, this conceptual challenge, it brings us right to Malefisante's really key idea of off-centeredness.
Okay, let's unpack off-centeredness. The idea that the identity problem comes from being sort of knocked off your own cultural axis,
Yeah.
dislocated from African terms because of these foreign intrusions.
Precisely. It means that both groups, the descendants of the enslaved and those who lived under colonialism on the continent, were forced off their own terms of reference. They had to operate within a Western framework, culture, politics, spirituality, that constantly denied their history, their intellectual worth.
So your own culture isn't the center anymore, the imposed culture is.
Exactly, and that's an immense psychological and spiritual trauma. The sources are explicit. This terror destroyed societies, erased history. British colonialism, for example, actively destroyed or removed African artifacts and records.
Right.
And even today, many African societies are still grappling with instability rooted in that past terror.
And this level of devastation, it was sometimes even incomprehensible back in Africa during the slave trade itself, wasn't it? Our sources mention that some African states, like Angola, actually tried to stop the trade once they realized how brutal the treatment was in the Americas, how different it was.
That's such a critical detail. It shows that the sheer cruelty, the chattel nature of the transatlantic system, was often unprecedented, even inconceivable, to African political systems back home. Slavery existed there, yes, but it was fundamentally different, usually not perpetual, not racially defined in the same way, not the inheritable chattel status seen in the Americas.
So the devastation was universal, really, affecting those taken and those left behind through this massive social and political upheaval.
Absolutely. A shared, though differently experienced, trauma.
Okay, so despite that immense trauma, that cultural suppression we've been discussing, the story of the diaspora is equally one of incredible resilience, isn't it?
Extraordinary resilience, yes.
The sources really highlight how, even in the worst conditions, bondage, oppression, enslaved Africans actively forged new, dynamic identities, blending folklore, language, music, food, creating something new.
Yeah, the way folklore was kept alive and evolved is just a powerful testament to the human spirit. Survivors of the Middle Passage, they transplanted African stories, narrative structures, into the New World, but they adapted them, using local animals, local landscape.
And this folklore wasn't just entertainment, it served crucial functions, right?
Absolutely, practical functions, conveying religious views, detailing family routines, birth, death rituals, and, maybe most importantly, offering coded lessons. Lessons for survival in those incredibly harsh conditions.
And it wasn't just oral. Culture was embedded in physical things, too.
Enslaved craftspeople, using local materials, wood, gourds, clays. They made things like canoes, intricate combs, stools, pottery. They were preserving ancestral skills, yes, but also transmitting cultural memory through these objects, tangible links to the past.
When we look at specific examples of folklore, you really see that synthesis, that blending.
You do. The sources mention trickster tales, like Brer Rabbit or Uncle Remus in the U.S. South. They took African themes of cunning, adaptability, and often mixed them with local Native American folklore traditions.
Right. And elsewhere?
Well, you have the famous Anansi the Spider Tales in Jamaica, the ultimate clever trickster, or the Buki stories in Haiti. In all these cases, the folklore adapted. It used New World settings and characters to subtly comment on, or even subvert, the power dynamics of slavery.
Language obviously was another immediate challenge and a necessity. You had people from so many different African societies speaking different languages thrown together.
Exactly. So how do you communicate?
How did that necessity lead to completely new language forms?
Well, sheer need created new linguistic forms.
Hmm.
Initially, you had early pidgin languages developing, often based on the Portuguese used by sailors and traders on the coast, kind of basic common tongue. Then, as other European powers became dominant, that pattern shifted. Eventually, fully fledged Creole languages developed in the Americas. These weren't simplified languages. They were complex, stable languages in their own right. They blended syntax, grammatical features from various African languages, but applied them mostly to European vocabulary, French, Spanish, English, etc.
And that blending points to something often overlooked: the role of interpreters.
Yes.
Sources mention that biracial children, often born on the coast, who were fluent in both African and European languages, were sometimes used as interpreters, both at embarkation points and later in the Americas.
It's a really bitter irony, isn't it? These individuals ended up facilitating this horrific process, but their existence also shows that linguistic blending was essential right from the start. It ensured some cultural knowledge, filtered through language, could survive, even amidst the chaos.
Music. This feels like one of the most vibrant areas of resistance and innovation. Why is the music of the diaspora so crucial?
Well, think about it. Enslavers systematically stripped people of their material possessions during the Middle Passage. Yet survivors showed incredible ingenuity. They recreated or invented instruments using whatever was available: gourds, shells, wood, bones, string,
Making drums, rattles, bells.
and the banjo, which is the direct ancestor of the modern banjo, alongside things like fiddles. Music wasn't just entertainment, it was a cultural lifeline, a way to hold on to identity, a historical record in sound.
And this creativity was immediately met with fear and suppression from the enslavers, wasn't it?
Instantly. The sources are clear. Europeans passed laws banning large gatherings, banning loud instruments, especially drumming, or using conch shells.
Why the fear?
Because drumming, in many African cultures, was a powerful, fast, often very sophisticated way to communicate over long distances. And it was totally opaque to the masters.
Ah, so they feared coordination.
Rebellion.
Exactly. They feared coordinated communication could lead directly to uprisings.
But even with these bans, communities found ways, using hidden codes. Yes. They embedded messages within the music. Hidden meanings in the lyrics of spirituals, work songs, or even in the rhythms themselves. Music became absolutely essential for social cohesion, for religious life. And it led to these powerful blended forms that still resonate today.
Can you give some examples of those blended forms, especially ones that served a kind of dual purpose?
Sure. In the U.S., you see the ring shout emerging in the 19th century. It was a distinct form of religious worship. It combined dance, music, Christian hymns, but kept powerful African elements: syncopation, polyrhythms, call and response. It allowed for spiritual expression while maintaining cultural integrity.
Okay. And more dramatic examples.
Well, in Brazil, especially in those isolated communities of escaped slaves called quilombos, they developed capoeira.
Capoeira. Dance fighting.
Exactly. It's the ultimate blend.
Yeah.
Dance, song, instruments, and martial arts. It was brilliantly disguised as just a dance. That allowed practitioners to develop and maintain fighting skills for self-defense, for resistance, without alerting the authorities to their real intent.
Incredible. And even European military structures unintentionally played a part in cultural adaptation.
They did. Military service, even if forced, exposed Black individuals to European instruments like drums, trumpets, fifes. And that those traditions were then absorbed and incorporated into existing cultural forms. You see the legacy in groups like the Took Band of Barbados. It shows how African cultural frameworks could absorb external things and repurpose them.
Okay, finally in this section, let's touch on food waste, because they also illustrate this cultural blending perfectly. What was the diet actually like during the Middle Passage?
Grim. Purely about minimal survival. A crude mix of whatever they could get on the African coast or imported staples: oats, peas, beans, corn, plantains, rice. Boiled up, maybe with some oil and pepper. But the real priority on those ships: water. They often dedicated far more space to water barrels than to the people themselves. Just shows the desperation of that journey.
But once in the New World, the diet had to adapt, become a blend.
Absolutely, it had to. And it became this rich, sophisticated fusion. Foodways blended African staples, things like okra, rice, ackee, yams with European influences, and crucially, ingredients from Native American agriculture. Food became the ultimate mix of what was available and remembered ancestral cooking techniques. Even the rations provided by masters were adapted, like cheap saltfish from Newfoundland, a common protein source on Caribbean plantations.
And the sources point to Jamaica's national dish, ackee and saltfish, as the perfect symbol of this diasporic fusion.
It really is a remarkable summary on a plate, isn't it? You've got the ackee fruit, native to West Africa, deliberately brought over, combined with that cheap, preserved salt cod from the North Atlantic fisheries, and then it's all seasoned and garnished with local Caribbean spices. It perfectly shows how people took local and imported ingredients and created something new, something dynamic, that defined a local culinary identity.
So all this trauma, followed by this incredible cultural blending, it eventually led to more formal intellectual movements, didn't it? Movements trying to define and assert African identity on a global scale.
Yes, a necessary response.
Our sources point to three main philosophical pillars here: negritude, Afropolitanism, and Afrocentricity. Let's start with negritude.
Okay, negritude really emerged in the 1930s, mostly among French-speaking intellectuals like Aimé Césaire, Léopold Senghor. It was fundamentally a political and cultural movement born out of resistance to French colonial assimilation policies.
Right, they didn't want to just become French.
Exactly. It proclaimed a fierce pride in blackness. It asserted that African civilization had unique, indispensable contributions to make to world history, particularly, they argued, in emotion, creativity, spirituality.
It wasn't just about internal pride, was it? It was aimed outwards, too.
Very much so. It was a conscious effort to push back against Western prejudice, to reaffirm African history and heritage. It strongly advocated for mutual respect between cultures. The idea was, for the world to move beyond colonialism, all countries needed to contribute their unique strengths.
But it had limitations.
Well, one challenge was that its framework often seemed most relevant to those still quite connected to traditional African cultures. It could be harder for the more culturally hybrid diaspora, further removed, to fully apply its tenets.
Which maybe sets the stage for Afropolitanism decades later. How would you define that?
Afropolitanism is often described as a kind of new phenomenology of Africanness. It shifts the focus, less on the historical trauma, more on the cosmopolitan, contemporary reality of Africans interacting globally today. It's often associated with a certain class-privileged, globally mobile children of migrants, what Tai Selassie called the cultural hybrid scene.
Right, you picture them in London, New York, Johannesburg.
Exactly. Effortlessly blending, say, kente cloth with international fashion, comfortable moving between continents, fluent in multiple cultural languages.
It sounds positive, forward-looking, a counter-narrative to the persistent Afro-pessimism we often see in Western media.
It is intended that way, yes.
Yet the sources we looked at also carry a pretty significant critique of Afropolitanism.
They do. While it definitely challenges the single story of Africa as just war and poverty, it gets criticized for being, essentially, the narrative of the few privileged.
Okay.
Sources question its depth of political engagement. If these Afropolitans grew up relatively insulated, maybe with domestic help, Western education, living in protected areas, do they really understand, or are they truly focused on addressing the widespread poverty or social issues faced by the majority?
So the critique is that it's more about lifestyle and mobility than collective struggle.
That's the core of the critique, yes. An identity defined by consumption and travel, perhaps, rather than shared political goals.
Which brings us to the third pillar, Afrocentricity, particularly associated with Molefi Asante. This seems positioned as a more grounded collective answer.
That's the intention. Afrocentricity argues for African people to be placed at the center of their own history, their own culture, their own traditions. It's presented as a vital identity precisely because it directly tackles that concept we discussed earlier, Asante's off-centeredness.
Right, the feeling of being dislocated?
Afrocentricity tries to remedy that. It insists every culture has the right to write its own history from its own perspective. It aims to project African people as centered, located, oriented, grounded in their own cultural terms, not constantly defining themselves in a reaction to Europe.
So it's not about claiming superiority over others.
No, not at all.
But about reestablishing the self as the primary point of reference.
Exactly. The goal is foundational self-knowledge, cultural location. It doesn't deny anyone else their place, it just demands a balance. It argues the European worldview shouldn't be the universal default, the only measure of human worth. It emphasizes that Africans, no matter how long the separation, still possess an African identity, an African consciousness. It's about fostering pride, self-awareness, agency.
Okay, now moving from these broad philosophies to something very current, often very raw, the internal debates within the diaspora itself. Our sources touched on this tension, particularly between descendants of U.S. chattel slavery, sometimes identifying as Ado, and more recent African immigrants or their children.
Yeah, this is a profoundly complex and sensitive area. It's rooted in different, though equally severe, experiences of historical trauma. We need to outline the ADOS position clearly first. ADOS stands for American Descendants of Slavery. Their argument centers on the recognition that their specific lineage carries a unique, multi-generational trauma, stemming directly from American chattel slavery, then Jim Crow segregation, and the systemic exploitation that followed, like sharecropping, redlining, lynching.
So their perspective, based on the sources, is really focused on protecting the integrity of that specific localized inherited trauma.
That seems to be a core part of it, yes. There's a concern that others who don't share that direct lineage, particularly recent immigrants, might sometimes, perhaps unintentionally, appropriate the struggle, meaning potentially leveraging the history of Black struggle in America for political or economic gain without having lived through or inherited the specific, centuries-long ADOS experience of suppression and violence. They might also point to the uncomfortable historical fact that some African groups or leaders did participate in the slave trade, creating another layer of distinction from recent immigrants whose ancestors remained in Africa.
But the African and immigrant perspective pushes back strongly against this, doesn't it? Arguing that while the trauma is different, it's equally brutal, equally vast.
That's absolutely the crux of the counterargument, that slavery and colonialism devastated all sides of the diaspora, just in different ways, different places, different times. They challenge the stereotype of the wealthy African immigrant, pointing out that the truly wealthy often stay in Africa. Many who emigrate are fleeing profound poverty, instability, often making huge sacrifices to do so.
And they emphasize the immense suffering that happened on the continent under colonialism, citing things like genocide figures.
Precisely. They argue colonialism involved wholesale genocide, resource theft on a massive scale, citing the horrific estimate of up to 10 million Congolese killed under King Leopold's rule in the Congo Free State. That's trauma inflicted directly on the continent.
Yeah.
They also talk about widespread land theft, forced labor within Africa, and the deliberate erasure of histories and even languages.
Like the example that the very name Yoruba, one of West Africa's largest ethnic groups, is actually a colonial label.
Exactly, meaning the group literally lost its original self-chosen name through this colonial process.
Yeah.
That's a profound identity disruption.
So this whole debate highlights that the trauma isn't monolithic. It's vast, yes, but also distributed differently with different timings and effects across the global Black community.
Definitely.
Yet, despite these internal differences, the sources suggest there's a clear unifying external factor that often forces a kind of consensus.
And that consensus is vital, I think, for moving forward.
Yeah.
Despite the differences in history, lineage, location, whether your family faced Jim Crow in Mississippi or colonial terror in the Congo, the sources really stress that the hegemonic culture often tries to treat us the same.
Right.
As one source bluntly put it, when you're facing systemic prejudice, a white police officer isn't going to care if you're African or African American.
Yeah.
That foundational struggle against systemic racism, against anti-Blackness, that remains a shared reality, a continuous burden stemming from the long shadow of slavery and colonialism.
Okay, moving forward then, let's focus on the diaspora's concrete impact today, starting with its undeniable economic power. The scale of financial contribution back to the continent, especially through remittances, it's just transformative.
The numbers are genuinely astonishing. They really demand attention. Migrant workers sent over $95 billion in remittances to and within Africa in 2021 alone.
95 billion.
And to get that context, because context is everything here, that amount absolutely dwarfs traditional capital sources like foreign direct investment or FDI.
Okay, let's just quickly clarify FDI for listeners. Foreign direct investment, that's typically big money, right? Long-term investments from foreign companies or governments into African businesses, infrastructure.
Exactly. It's usually policy-backed, aiming for long-term, scalable projects, building factories, roads, things like that. Remittances, on the other hand, are mostly personal, informal, often small, recurring payments between family members.
So why is that comparison $95 billion in remittances versus FDI so stark?
Well, look at Nigeria in 2021, for example. Sources say it received about $23.8 billion in remittances.
Okay.
In the same year, only $2.4 billion in FDI.
Wow, nearly 10 times more from personal remittances.
Exactly. It shows this deep personal commitment from the diaspora for economic support, outweighing official government and corporate investment massively in some places.
So what are people actually using this huge sum of money for? Is it going into starting businesses or more towards basic needs?
The survey data is pretty clear on this. It's primarily a lifeline. The top reasons cited for sending money back. School or educational fees, that was number one, 74.4% of respondents.
Okay, education. Makes sense.
Followed closely by food and basic household support, about 65%. And then medical bills and rent, both around 60%. So yes, remittances are absolutely crucial for survival, for helping the next generation get ahead through education. But they aren't, generally speaking, funding large-scale national investment on their own.
Which leads right into the challenges, doesn't it? Relying so heavily on this informal flow of capital. What are the downsides for sustainable development?
There are a few key limitations. First, as we said, they're not easily scalable for big national projects like infrastructure. And there's a potential risk of fostering dependency, maybe hindering broader economic diversification if it becomes the main source of income.
Okay.
Second, they can make economies a bit volatile because they depend on global job markets where migrants work. If there's a downturn elsewhere, remittances can drop. And third, maybe the most pressing issue, the cost of sending money.
Ah, the transaction fees.
Exactly. Sub-Saharan Africa is still the most expensive region in the world to send money to. The average cost is around 8.7%.
That's huge, like a tax on families supporting each other.
It essentially is a tax on poverty reduction. So there's a critical need for policy changes, financial innovation, fintech, to bring those costs down dramatically.
So if remittances are largely going towards consumption and basic needs, how do you shift the narrative? How do you move from worrying about brain drain, skilled people leaving,
To something more positive, like brain circulation.
exactly, where skills and capital flow back and forth?
It involves finding ways to leverage the other huge financial potential the diaspora represents beyond just those small regular payments. We're talking about savings. The estimated annual savings of African migrants globally,
Yeah.
conservatively put at around $33.7 billion.
Wow, another massive number.
Right. And that capital is currently mostly invested outside Africa. So the challenge is creating policy frameworks, incentives, to channel some of that back into sustainable investment, trade, entrepreneurship on the continent.
What kind of practical mechanisms could do that, policy-wise?
Well, governments need to actively bring the diaspora into policy discussions, make it mainstream. Practical tools could include things like creating specific diaspora bonds. These are government or corporate bonds targeted directly at diaspora communities. They offer potentially stable returns, while the capital funds national development projects, infrastructure, maybe specific industries.
Okay, so a direct investment channel.
Exactly. Plus, promoting digitization in fintech isn't just about lowering remittance costs. It's also about making investment easier, more transparent. The overall goal is partnership, building capacity, sharing skills, sharing knowledge, transforming individual savings into collective socioeconomic progress.
Okay, let's shift gears slightly to the political and ethical dimension. The sources strongly highlight the ongoing global call for justice, specifically for reparations. What's the current momentum there?
It seems to be building, particularly driven by international bodies. The UN Permanent Forum on People of African Descent is very vocal on this. They emphatically call reparations essential to rectify past injustices. They frame it as a cornerstone of justice in the 21st century.
And they're talking about more than just financial payments, right?
Absolutely. It's framed as comprehensive measures
Yeah.
designed to address both the material and the deep psychological damage caused by centuries of slavery and colonialism.
And the argument is that this legacy isn't just historical ancient history, it's active today.
Precisely. The forum emphasizes that the long shadows of colonialism, enslavement, apartheid, they still result in systemic racial discrimination right now across the globe. They point to specifics. People of African descent being disproportionately exposed to police violence, suffering huge health disparities, facing persistent economic discrimination in housing, jobs.
So the call is for concrete action.
Yes, they recommend all UN member states need to educate themselves and the public on these histories and legacies, to actively work to eliminate all forms of racial discrimination, and to acknowledge the ongoing debt, the ongoing impact.
It's encouraging, though, to see some African nations taking proactive steps towards reconciliation and reunification themselves. Ghana's Year of Return in 2019 and the ongoing Beyond the Return initiative.
Yes, those are powerful examples. Conscious government policy aimed at encouraging descendants of the enslaved, especially in the Americas, to reconnect with their ancestral roots.
Offering pathways to citizenship, cultural exchange, investment opportunities.
Right. It's fostering that spirit of Pan-Africanism in a very practical way, creating real mechanisms for connection, for potential collective healing. It's a profound official acknowledgement that the trauma was shared, and the path forward perhaps needs to be collective too.
So, wrapping up this deep dive, it really highlights a fundamental paradox, doesn't it? The African diaspora is this identity born from unimaginable trauma-forced removal, the imposition of race as a concept.
It's a generational trend.
Yet, out of that same devastating history comes this incredibly dynamic, globally influential cultural force. And significant economic power, too. We've talked about the destruction, but also the resilience. Capoeira, the ring shout, the amazing fusion food.
And we've seen how that history shapes the intense, really vital debates happening right now.
Yeah.
That struggle for recognition between communities whose ancestors were taken and those whose ancestors faced colonialism and genocide on the continent. And yet, emerging from all that is this economic reality that $95 billion plus in annual remittances alone. It's an immense potential lever, isn't it? Politically, economically, even if it's largely unstructured right now.
Which brings us to a final thought for you, our listeners. Given that we've seen this historical trauma is so vast, so complex, distributed differently, chattel slavery here, colonialism there, apartheid somewhere else, is the most productive way forward just reconciliation over shared suffering, or is it something more active? Could the focus now shift towards collective mobilization, towards consciously harnessing that immense $95 billion plus economic power?
Turning it from mostly consumption-based remittances into something more structured, scalable investment.
Exactly. Investment aimed at achieving shared, quantifiable political and economic goals. Goals for the entire global diaspora community. Is that the next chapter? Something to think about. We encourage you to subscribe, like, and comment to share your own thoughts on this deep dive and perhaps on that question of collective mobilization.
Thank you for listening to VSOW.